Hey everybody, I'm Sarah, Lonesome Glory, and today we are here for another not-so-scientific Breyer Science video. So today's video is based on a comment by one of you lovely viewers, and I'm not going to call you out by name just in case you don't want me to do that, but you know who you are, and thank you so much for this idea. I had a lot of fun putting it together. Today we are going to talk about which Breyer traditional molds are in desperate need of a new regular run. I'm pretty excited because this is one of those kind of ideas that can go a billion different directions. So I really had to sit down and think about which molds need a new run versus which ones I just desperately want to see new colors on. So I went through all of Breyer's traditional molds and came up with some criteria to kind of narrow it down. So let's work through what I did. To start with, I looked at Identifier Breyer, which is probably the best and easiest source of information on Breyer molds and models on the internet. Thank you very much for putting that together. And based on that, I determined that there were 177 Breyer traditional molds. I will note that Identifier Breyer lists 178. They count the Shire Mare, which has only been made in porcelain and crystal at this point. I decided not to count that because I only wanted to look at plastic. So, 177 traditional Breyer molds. And that's too many to talk about in a video. So I decided to narrow that down to molds that had not had a regular run release, a specifically regular run in the catalog release in the last 5 years. So if they had been available for purchase on Breyer's website or from your local dealer as a regular run since 2015, I knocked them right off the list. That didn't help as much as I thought it was going to. I still wound up with 79 molds, which was a lot. So from there, I had to figure out which of those molds actually need a release in my mind versus ones that we just want to see a release on. And there were a lot of different criteria I could have used. I could have looked at how expensive those molds were to buy on the secondary market. I could have looked at the different colors that had already been made on the mold, as in how many releases they had had previously. I could have looked at how popular the mold was, things like that. And I decided to do it kind of like I did my conspiracy video from a couple of years ago for the surprise model and just start knocking molds out by category. So I went through all of the remaining molds and started knocking off which ones didn't need a new mold based on some very unscientific categories that I came up with. And what I came down to was 17 molds. 17. So let's talk about how I got to 17 molds that absolutely Breyer needs to give a regular run release to. The first category I used to just knock molds out, molds that did not need a release, were molds that just could not possibly have had a release in the last 5 years. I'm not saying that these molds shouldn't get a release or I wouldn't like to see a release on them, but they're not in the desperate need category, frankly, for a few of them because Breyer just hasn't had a chance. And the first three on that list were this year's Premier Club releases, the Akotiki, Troubadour, and Vermeer. Breyer just released them. It's going to be at least a year, if not two, before they get a regular run release, given the pattern that Breyer's had with the rest of their Premier Club. Yes, I want them to be readily available to people who aren't in the Premier Club, but I don't think they're at the need stage yet. A couple of years down the line, if I'd have done this video, I would have put them in that category. But they're not yet there yet. There's no possible way for Breyer to have given them a release, so they're off the list. There were 5 total in that category, beside the 3 that I've already listed, and then Hala and Albaroso. There's no way for Breyer to give releases on those molds either. Breyer has said in the past that the Hala mold, which got retooled into Bolia, was destroyed, damaged. There was something wrong with it, so it could not be used in its original form. So any releases that they've done, they did that Dixon mold for one of the special collectors events, and the one that got put in one of the Breyer Fest auctions recently, were off of old castings from that mold. So there's nothing available for Breyer to make a regular run. And of course, Albarosa was famous. That mold was famously destroyed after the production of the Celebration model in 2008. So can't have molds on them. They don't get to go in they need a release, even though, like everybody else, I'd love to have a traditional release on the Albarosa mold, but we'll just have to content ourselves with the stablemates. Okay, the next category, I took out the 6 horses on the list that hadn't had regular runs that had gotten limited edition brick and mortar releases. And the reason I did that is because those releases, while limited, are fairly available to collectors. That would have been the American Saddlebred with Patriot, the Andalusian Stallion with Glorioso, the Clydesdale Stallion with Seamus, Goffert with Crystalline back here, Nakota, who had Illumination and Toro in the last 5 years, and then Silver with Liberty. Now, Silver also has the new Black Beauty out and 2 or 3 other things, so he was getting off the list anyway. But that's the reason I took those 6 molds off the list. I understand that those horses are sometimes a little more expensive, but it just kind of struck me that those were kind of available and probably meant that they didn't need a regular run as much as some of the other molds. The next category I decided to use to remove horses from this great big pool, because at this point I still have 61 molds on my list, was to take away molds that had other reasonably available releases. And I say reasonably available because they are not regular runs, but they're not web specials, they're not limited editions, they're not something that sells out so quickly that it's really hard for people to get a hold of them. I mainly had these in the category of like store specials for local stores like Tractor Supply and things like that. So the molds that are on this list are Bluegrass Bandit, Jim Twist, the Ranch Horse, Roy, the Shire Mare, the Stock Horse Mare, and the Clydesdale Mare. This is the category where me being nitpicky over need versus want really came into play. I decided when I started this whole thing that I would talk about molds that needed a release, and by needed I meant molds that were popular, that hadn't had a release in a long time, that collectors would be excited about them getting a release. And unfortunately, that meant that a lot of vintage molds weren't going to be on my final list. And it's not because I don't love some of these. I quite honestly, there's a few on this list that kind of hurt me to put there, because I would love to see new colors on some of these molds. But I don't think if they were released as a regular run, they would be super popular with a lot of collectors, or they would sell very well, and it wouldn't be something I can see Breyer doing. However, I put them on this list thinking this is the vintage clubs zone. This is what they're for. Hopefully, some of the molds that we see on this list will be like vintage club. So if your favorite model happens to be on this list, I'm sorry. I don't mean it as an insult. Like I said, I'm actually kind of sad about a couple of these, but it's really, this is the list of molds that would be better used by the vintage club as opposed to a regular run, or molds that I think have already been used by the vintage club and therefore don't need a regular run to get into collectors' hands. So there's 29 that I put here. And rather than reading them all out, I'm just gonna let them kind of scroll on by. We're still in the like super subjective category of this. And after I called out all of the vintage club, vintage molds, there were still a few molds I'd left on the list that I realized were either best suited to the vintage club and were still on the list just because it hurt me as a collector because I love them so much to put them on the list, or I just really liked them. So I went back and tried to be a little more objective, and I pulled out 10 more molds, which took me down to 22 left, which is good. I'm now getting into a reasonable number of molds. But the ones that I pulled out this time probably fit in some of the other categories I've already talked about. Most of them probably fit in that vintage club mold, but these were the ones that I personally think need a release. Like, I really want new colors. I want to see a regular run. I want to see something cool on these molds. After all of that, I am left with 22 molds. And 5 of those I don't know really need a new release. But I didn't take them off the list because of the way Breyer has been doing some of their new marketing. They have gone unicorn crazy at Breyer. You guys have seen all of the fun unicorn releases that they've been doing. They put a horn on Croy and a horn on Sea Star of all the old molds and made this adorable little set last year. So I got to thinking, there are a handful of old molds that are pretty, but not really conformationally great. So they don't show well, which makes them not very popular with collectors. Or they're just really stylized and really unicorn-esque. And I thought these would be really cool if Breyer would release them as a unicorn. So there are 5 molds I put on that list, which meant I hadn't taken them out at the Vintage Club phase. And frankly, all but one of these would have come out at that stage. These 5 I think should be unicorns. I think Lady Roxana would make the cutest unicorn. Misty's Twilight would be absolutely beautiful. The Show Stance Morgan, the old Show Stance Morgan. The Sherman Morgan with that funky tail and the way his neck is all bent. And then the one that would have made my final needs a new release mold is Legionario. That horse is absolutely beautiful. It actually is popular with collectors. It shows pretty well. But wouldn't that be a cool unicorn? I think he looks mystical. And because of that, I put him on that list as opposed to on the needs a new mold list. Or needs a new release list. So, this is where the subjective comes in. But just know Legionario is only on that list because I really just think he'd be a cool unicorn since Breyer likes putting horns on things now. And if they're going to do that, they might as well do it on something that would look really awesome. So those are my next 5, and I'm down to the final 17. All right, guys, we made it. There were 177 molds when we started. We are down to 17, the final 17, that I think need a new release. Now, some of these have had releases in the past few years, but those releases have been either very limited edition or have been web specials or have been BreyerFest specials. There hasn't been a regular run since at least 2015. So, without further ado, here is the final list. All right, first on the list of molds that need a regular run is Ashley. She hasn't had a regular run since 2014. Next up is Esprit. Esprit's had a couple of special runs, but no actual regular run for quite a while. We did see him as the surprise model in 2016 at BreyerFest, and in 2017 as a web special with St. Moritz. Then there's George, who is a fairly new mold from Breyer. We did see him as the BreyerFest special run this year, but no regular run at all yet. So maybe we'll see him in the 2021 lineup. After that, there is Huckleberry Bay. And Huckleberry Bay, as popular as he is and as pretty as he is, hasn't had a regular run since 2013. And I will point out, as I'm listing these dates, I went by the date when the regular run was retired, not when it was initially released. So if these sound a little off, that's why. After that, there's two molds. They each count, but they've always been released together. And that is Secession and LaFire, the Mare and Colt. They have not been seen in the regular run lineup since 2008, although the original Secession and LaFire were released in 2014 as warehouse finds. They haven't been available as regular runs since 2008. We did see them as web specials again in 2017, Zion and Moab, which I'm probably pronouncing wrong. The next one, I don't have one just here in this house, they're all over at Mom's, but that is the Lying Down Foal. The original version of Ashley hasn't had a regular run release since 1996. Come on, Breyer, we need some more baby horses. After that, it is Foxtrotter time. The Missouri Foxtrotter hasn't had a release since 2012, although there was a special run made for Chasing the Chesapeake Raven in 2016. Though that was a seriously limited release, so, you know. After the Missouri Foxtrotter, there's another 3 molds. They're not always released together, so they each have different final release dates. There's the Proud Arabian Foal, who was last released as a regular run in the year 2000. There's the Proud Arabian Mare, who was last released in 2003. And then the Proud Arabian Stallion we saw in 2009. Now, each of these have had, well, except for the Proud Arabian Foal, the others have had limited releases. The Proud Arabian Stallion was a raffle model at BreyerFest in 2015. And the Mare has been making a comeback with the Vintage Club and then at BreyerFest in 2018. But we haven't seen like a set of the Mare and Foal, and we certainly haven't seen all 3 of them together or even a release of them in a long time. So these guys, they need some regular run love. Next is the model that was generally a companion to the Lying Down Foal. Breyer did some sets of this, or at least released them in similar colors, and that is the Scratching Foal. And the Scratching Foal hasn't had a regular run release since 2009. And in case you guys don't recognize this one, this is a test run from, I think, 2002. I got him at BreyerFest, so yeah, this is my my baby. Anyway, I think that these guys need a new regular run release. And it's especially, to me, these guys could be on the regular run line as opposed to the vintage line, especially since Breyer makes all of the little full sets with the blankets and things like that. It's a little surprising that they haven't come out with a set. All right. Next up is the semi-rearing Mustang, who we seem to see all the time as a special run or as a limited run, but not as a regular run. He was in 2015. We saw this guy specifically, Our Kind of Town. He was the model for the Sweet Home Chicago event. Then 2017, Breyerfest, we got Darjeeling, which was really pretty. And then the Vintage Club got Tanner in 2018. But he hasn't been available on the regular run line since 2009. So we'd like to see him come back. The other one is Sham. Sham has had a couple of regular run releases within recent memory, but not in the last 5 years. So in 2014, they retired the last regular run Sham. And then the only other time we've seen him since was this past year at Breyerfest as Lou. And then, of course, two more molds that go together. The Welsh Mare and Colts. We've seen them at Breyerfest as raffle models. We saw this set this year at Breyerfest. The Colt was part of a web special this past year for the Wild Animal series, but we don't have a regular run. They are old enough now off the Premier line that they need one. It is time. I want to see lots of little customs on these, and we're not going to see that until we get regular runs, I don't think. So it's time. So that's 16. We are at 16 if you haven't been counting. The last one is one that is near and dear to my heart. I desperately, desperately want a new regular run on this. It is the Zebra. Breyer did us a solid last year at Breyerfest when they came out with these candy cane zebras. They were super duper cute. And we saw the same mold at Breyerfest in 2015. They painted him up like the Caves of Lascaux. But the original zebra that ended its run in 2004 is the only regular run we've ever gotten. The only one. So I would like to see him in one of Breyer's new fancy, 2020 paint jobs, just as a zebra. I think it would look really cool. Although they did that one that year for the auction that was a fruit stripe, like the gum. And I wouldn't say no. Wouldn't say no if Breyer wanted to make that a regular run. But anyway, the zebra needs a new regular run. Well, I hope you have enjoyed this little not so scientific trip down molds that I think need a new regular run release. It's been a lot of fun kind of putting this together, going through some of the older molds and the new molds just to see what's out there. Thank you to Identify Your Breyer, because without that site, this would not have happened. Thank you to my friend in the comments who gave me this idea. You know who you are. And thank you to all of you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed. If you have ideas for videos, see, I do sometimes take them, so let me know down in the comments below. Let me know in the comments which molds you think need a regular run release, because I'm sure that you have completely different criteria than I do, and we'll have some completely different ideas. For now, stay home, stay safe, wear a mask, and go ahead and subscribe if you aren't already. Check me out on Instagram if you haven't, and have happy holidays. Bye, everybody.